Welcome to the Vandy Sports Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Lee. Our guest today, New York Dore. We will talk Vanderbilt baseball. Our show presented by the Well Coffee House, which turns coffee into water. The Well is a coffee house with a mission to bring clean water to the world. To date, over 30 communities across the globe have access to safe water, health, and hope. You too can make an impact by visiting a Well Coffee House location today. There are 5 to serve you in the Nashville area. They are Brentwood, Green Hills downtown, Bellevue, and the Cool Springs Lifeway. More information can be found at wellcoffeehouse.org. The Well Coffee House, where coffee changes lives. We also thank our co-sponsor, WellSpire, Nashville's Learning and Development Center, which is located in the Gulch. Vanderbilt takes a Tuesday baseball game from Western Kentucky. Final in that one 5-4. Commodores trail 4-2 headed to the ninth. Austin Martin and J.J. Bleday hit solo home runs. Bleday with a bloop single to right to drive in the winning run in the 10th. Commodores travel to Athens, Georgia for their 4th SEC series of the year this coming weekend. In other news, basketball player Simi Shittu has declared for the pros. Shittu was a 5-star recruit who finished his freshman season at Vanderbilt just a couple of weeks ago. And as always, we thank our news sponsor. They are Sutherland & Belk, a local injury law firm committed to helping those who've been injured in accidents. If you or someone you know has been in a wreck or other accident, reach out to Sutherland & Belk, see what your rights are. You can find their contact info online at sbinjurylaw.com. Our good friend New York Dore joins us today. This is Wednesday afternoon, the night before the Commodores beat Western Kentucky in a pretty dramatic finish. Took 2 of 3 over Tennessee this weekend. A pretty good offensive weekend against a Vol team that after the weekend still leads the country in ERA. So on the whole, New York Dore, a pretty good week for the Commodores, and thank you for joining us.
Pleasure as always to be here. Yeah, I mean, listen, Sunday, we didn't win. That stinks. Well, I'm sure we'll hem and haw over why Kiambu wasn't a pinch runner instead of Walker. I don't know what the speed difference is there, and I think you just give credit to Tennessee's shortstop in particular for making a great scoop and a better throw. It was reminiscent of Dansby had a great relay in his junior year. I'm trying to remember exactly against whom that was, but you tip your cap to a great play. And Sunday's game was in many ways a great game. A little ugliness early, but all in all, what a week! What a 10-day span, or at this point, 11-day span. Bleday is homered in 5 of the last 6 games. One national or SEC player of the week, I should say. Just last night, as we were just discussing before the pod, we both missed the first portion of the game. You missed the first half of it. I missed the first 7.5 innings and tuned in just in time for, Martin and Bleday to go back-to-back to tie it. Ethan Smith to test our tolerance for believing our eyes with respect to the jugs gun in the stadium, touching 100 at one point would probably temper that by 3 or 4 miles an hour. But and then the dramatic walk-off from JJ in the 10th against the Vols this weekend. It was a very well-played weekend for Vanderbilt. And I just, sometimes you tip your cap to the opponent, both on the defensive play and also they had a very good attack vector for Kumar, which is they were just sitting dead red heat, put bat on ball, and they found some holes and, piled up some hits. The one thing I would note with Kumar, he had a little bit of wildness mixed in, but generally, again, he was attacking the zone. When he got his curveball going or his slider going for a while, he actually looked pretty good. Even David Price had a 4.5 ERA as a sophomore. I look for the positives with Kumar, and I still see him and the room for growth, and not at all disappointed in his performance. I'm sure he'd like to have not given up as many singles as he did, but I'll take losing death by 10 singles over death by 8 walks any day of the week. And Kumar continues to be an aggressive attacking pitcher. And I take that as a positive. His one outing out in Arizona aside where he just couldn't throw a strike.
Well, the hitting has been phenomenal all year. It continues to amaze me. We'll get into that in a bit. But I think the biggest thing that has changed since the two of us talked is the bullpen, which went from holy cow, this is awful, to holy cow, this is pretty spectacular, basically in the last week or two.
I don't want to, I'm a little hesitant to give too much credit on, or give too much of a perspective that our bullpen woes are woe-begones, if you will. I don't know if that's the proper word, use of the word woe-begone, but I don't think they're behind us. I think that what you've seen is Corbin and Brownie have reduced the level of use. And I think if you talk to them, they probably would prefer to be in a situation where the circle of trust was a little larger for a little longer into the season. In the last couple of weekends, we've seen playoff style roster management from Corbs with respect to the pitching staff. It's been reliance on the trusted arms and not expanding into some of the less well tested ones, or in the case of Jackie Fastball, a guy who is still trying to get back to his normal. So when we talk about performance, Tyler Brown now up to number 6 in D1's power rankings of the best relievers. Not surprising that we're seeing a heavy dose of him, and he continues to dominate. Hugh Fisher looked freaking outstanding on, was it Saturday against UT, Chris?
Yeah, I believe it was, yeah.
I think I tweeted out that, we had discussed on the podcast, I think 2 ago, that I think he's probably the second best pro pitching prospect on this staff. And he looked every bit of it on Saturday, bringing the heat, bringing the hook, and really getting some ugly swings. On top of that, Zach King continues to be a little up and down, but we've seen some doses of him. Jake Eater had his best performance as a Commodore, 13 up, 13 down on Sunday. Interestingly enough, he was doing that with a tick less velo and a little bit more placement and deception, and it worked out great. Another reminder that velocity is not the end-all, be-all. Eater's batting average against now in the season is down to a team low 120, which is, in case you're doing math at home, that's 6 hits and 14 1/3 innings. 6 hits, 7 walks. So we can still have some room to go on the walk front at 4.5 per 9, but he was outstanding. But this was the first time we'd seen Ethan Smith in a number of games, and he looked fantastic last night. He was the only Vandy pitcher I saw throw, simply because of how late I got to watch, and he was just lighting up the gun consistently at 96 on the TV gun and above, 96, 97, 98. And so maybe not having thrown in a while, I guess he was rearing to go. We saw Chance Huff. I understand it was success by interesting means. We'll see if he can work his way back into the active rotation here. We haven't seen Austin Becker in a while. We haven't seen Jackie Fastball in a while. We haven't seen AJ Franklin in a while. And, we haven't seen Eric Kaiser. We've only seen him once this year. I don't want to turn around and say the bullpen is looking better so much as the bullpen has reduced the number of arms that are seeing meaningful innings. In the land of indexing, they refer to it as longevity bias or something along those lines. The entities that stay in an index are the ones that are having success. You have a natural bias as an index progresses to having positive results. It's not an exact parallel, but we've seen a tightening of who's getting used in the bullpen. And that, above all else, I think is tied to the level of success over the last couple of weeks. It also didn't hurt that UT is not exactly Paul Bunyan out there, or Bill Brasky, or for our case, intents and purposes, Mike Baxter, with respect to swinging it. And their twin that was in the lineup this week was not the good hitting twin. I would temper the enthusiasm. Our players haven't changed. Just I think the level of how deep into the bullpen we're going has.
Yeah, and I appreciate the way that you explained that. I agree with it. The circle of trust may have tightened, but the point is the guys that are in that circle of trust right now are enough to get them through a weekend. Yeah, I mean, you've got – because I thought the thing about Smith last night wasn't just that he hit 100 – it was that he got 4 strikeouts in 2 perfect innings and only threw 20 pitches. He was super sharp. I don't know if they made an adjustment with his mechanics or something, but he looked like he was a major league pitcher last night, the way that he threw.
Yeah.
Now that may be a small sample, but you add in Eater, Brown, who I love, King, and Fisher. I mean, I just think that you've got more answers now.
Sticking on Smith for a second, he's the same guy he was a few weeks ago. He had a couple of bad outings where he wasn't locating. I don't see any tweaks in his motion. He loves to do the playful leg kick, and he was doing it last night with Haplom. But he is a supreme talent. Again, I'll note he was my guy coming into the year on the pitching side. Unfortunately, on the hitting side, none of the freshmen have really made an impact, as Corbs noted, that there was no getting in to this lineup for most of the freshmen. My guy on the hitting side was Jahan Malloy, and I have high hopes for him over the next couple of years, but a little realistic about whether or not he'll see the field this year. But I think Ethan has always been there. The arm is there. The curveball's great. It's just a matter of execution and wildness. I mean, 13 walks in 17 innings, and those were really compressed into his bad outings. He also, I think, was the victim of circumstances in a couple of appearances, including one where inherited runners were allowed to score. I think Hugh Fisher has been flashing the same stuff, but I mean, it was to a whole new level on execution on Saturday. And then, as we noted, Jake Heater, that was his best performance as a Commodore. If we can get Zach King right, if we can get Jackie fastball right, and if we can get some consistency out of Ethan Smith, or for Chance Huff to harness his prodigious arm, but that's a tough thing to do. We saw there are 2 sort of comparable players that I would point to when looking at Chance Huff, one of whom ended up being able to contribute out of the pen, one of whom didn't. That would be Matt McGarry and Maddox Conger, 2 guys with electric arms who had trouble with the ball not always going where they wanted it, and they each flashed moments, but one of them was able to somehow be able to harness things enough to be a reliable player at the end of his junior year, and the other just didn't. And we need to see if Chance can harness the stuff, because if you can't throw strikes, you can't throw them where you want it. You're not doing yourself a whole lot of good.
On to the hitting, I don't know much more what I can say about it. I think this sums it up pretty well. You've got guys like Ethan Paul and Steven Scott who are having, and Austin Martin, who are having, by Vanderbilt standards, historic years, are somewhere in that neighborhood. And the way J.J. Bleday's hitting, it's just sort of overshadowing all of it, even though Bleday's not that much better than some of those guys, like on a runs created per 27 outs basis. But here's where I'm going with this. You have Julian Infante hitting. You have Jason Gonzalez hitting. I mean, to some degree, they didn't look very good last night, but they've hit much better. You have Pat DeMarco coming back. It's just going to be a crazy problem, because throwing Walker Grisanti, who's looked competent, you may have 13 or 14 really good hitters that could play in any Vanderbilt lineup. And by the way, Ty Duvall's really hitting well too, the way we thought that he would. It's just crazy to look at how many bats they have, and somebody's going to be on the outs every game. Good problem to have, but I don't know how. I don't know what to expect going forward. I don't know if it'll be like platoon situations or what, but it is fascinating to look down that bench and see how many talented hitters are on that team.
Well, yeah, and I'm as big a Ty Duvall fan as you'll find. For 3 years, I've been saying we got to find a way to get him in the lineup. The reality is, this year I think it's a lot harder than the prior years, even though he's getting more playing time largely because of a couple of injury situations. But when Pat DeMarco comes back in, I mean, Pat's got to be in the lineup. I think he's one of our most dynamic hitters and a very good, if not elite, outfielder. I know a couple weeks ago might argue against that, but I think he's a good defender, someone who doesn't necessarily need a defensive replacement, which has been a bone of contention for me. I know I've talked to you a bit about that, Chris. But, when Pat does come back and when he's healthy, what's nice is we're in a circumstance where we don't need to rush him back in the similar way that, we can give people a breather when needed, as we've seen with Coop for some of the more recent midweek games and later inning defensive replacements when we have a nice lead. But I think what we'll see is, a little bit of slippage into a platoon. I think we're going to see Scotty play first against right-handed pitchers and Julian play first against left-handed pitchers. When Scotty is not at first, the question is, where do you shift him? And is that into the DH role? I know he took some reps at second base in the fall. We haven't seen him there this year during the regular season, but do they try and get a bat maximized offense, or do you trust that Harrison Ray's played pretty good second base? I mean, he really has. I know I at least privately gave grief over a couple instances where he didn't cover second on plays that didn't harm us, and wondering who's hammering him over this, but he's actually played a good second base, notwithstanding those two mental lapses, which again didn't cause any harm. Austin, he's sort of a jack of all trades, master of none on defense, and clearly he's in the lineup somewhere, just as with Scotty. The question is, where do you put him to maximize defense? I think when Pat comes back, Austin's got to be at third or second. With Pat out, you had a little more flexibility of who else will play. You could use JG and Harry on the infield, but with Pat back in the lineup, that shifts Scotty from left field into either the infield catching or DH, and that means Austin's got to be at third. The question then becomes, what do you do in the DH spot? I think the person who really is going to miss out the most probably is Ty Duvall. Assuming Harry has played well enough to cement himself at second, I think you see a reversion to what we were seeing before Pat went down, which was, no longer necessarily having the mystery DH, because that DH is going to be Steven Scott.
Let's go to our mailbag, which is sponsored by Vanderbilt fan and independent insurance agent Josh Minton of Brentwood. Do you need an insurance agent who wants to know your unique needs and circumstances and will tailor an insurance plan to fit them? Josh is your man. Call him 615-933-1979. Email him at josh@hqinsurance.com. Follow him on Facebook at facebook.com/JD Minton HQ. He's my agent. Give him a shot. I think you will be pleased. Ann Arbor Dore asks, why do we always seem to have problems with midweek pitchers who throw much slower? You'd think Corbin could find one of those guys on campus and give him a glorified manager role and allow the team to see that pitching live, or find a volunteer assistant who's a recent graduate with that pitching skill set.
Let's just bring back Jason Cunningham.
I like your idea. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that we've seen a couple instances of Corbs actually trying to go out and identify guys who didn't necessarily fit the Vanderbilt mold. And this isn't guys like Brian Miller who were, freaks where Brian Miller, when he was playing it, I can't recall of him, but I remember the story that he had a catcher and a backup catcher. And every time his backup catcher tried to catch him, just about every pitch ended up being a pass ball, because his ball just moved so much. But we have brought in some guys who didn't necessarily look always like a prototypical DJ style, Dirk Johnson style, 6'4" righty pumping 92 on a consistent basis and just sort of bullying you on the mound. We had guys like, Stephen Rice or even AJ Franklin for that matter, who over their careers ended up getting enough velocity that they were ticking 90 to 92, at least on the high end. But it's tough. I mean, yes, we can look at our midweek performances at times and said, why do we struggle with these guys? And are we just not seeing it enough? I don't know that that's the case. Sometimes it's just people who we've faced have brought their A game and most importantly thrown strikes. And maybe that's really the component. If you look at sort of you take a look at an evolutionary perspective on it, what is selected for when someone doesn't have overpowering stuff? And I don't care if it's at Lipscomb or Texas A&M. And the Sunday guy we faced, Roa or whatever his name was, who was touching 90, but not overpowering stuff. But when you don't have overpowering stuff, for you to be selected, for you to have success and be able to pitch at this level, the characteristic that is most shared among those people is they throw strikes and can place. So if you catch a kid like that on their A game, you're not getting free passes. You're not getting as many mistakes. You're relying more on your BABIP being on the north side of the norm rather than reverting to the norm or having a day where balls hit gloves. And I think that's probably more a factor than any. I mean, if you look at the games where in midweek play we don't have success versus the games where we do, usually it's because the games where we've had success, you look up and you see 7, 8, 9 walks or hit batsmen, put together with some murder ball of hits because pitchers are ending up throwing fastballs in a 2-0 count. And in the games where we haven't had success, if you look at it, it's been less runners in scoring position fail and more not getting on base because we're starting out 0-1 on counts and hitting in a 1-2 count instead of a 2-0 count. And that's where the difference is. I mean, we used to talk ad nauseum about expected runs tables when analyzing whether or not Vanderbilt was a good strategy. And the next progression on those types of tables, and before you get to something like a heat map chart of what pitches to swing at or what launch velocity, but the next iteration in between those two is looking at the success rates in specific counts. And there's the beauty of baseball is it's a game of numbers and a game of probabilities and statistics and tracking tendencies. And, the most powerful of all those tendencies is a guy hitting 2-0, 3-1, or is a guy hitting 0-2, 1-2. And that's really the prime difference is, are the people we're facing throwing strikes and throwing the strikes that they want? So I don't think, I liked Jason Cunningham. I think him walking to the bus in the 2007 SEC tournament, almost like he was walking down the aisle after getting married, after shutting down Ole Miss, was one of the greatest moments on perhaps the most memorable of Vanderbilt teams. But I don't think we're lacking for rubber-armed guys throwing 82.
Yeah, I was there for that, the Jason Cunningham moment. That was pretty neat to watch. But two questions here. They're tied together, so I will ask them together. Mr. Vandy asks, do you think Rocker should stay in the starting rotation? And Theodore 8 asks, what do you see as Mason Hickman's role in the pitching rotation this season, especially when tournament time rolls around?
Yeah, I think that's a tough question. I would not expect Mason to move into the weekend rotation this weekend or be available in the weekend rotation this weekend. It was the first time he ever pitched into the eighth inning as a Commodore this week. And to be honest, I think we're at a point where if it ain't broke, don't fix it. When we get to Hoover and when we get to a regional, when we get to Omaha, we're going to need to be 4 deep in the starting rotation. Do I think it matters whether or not we have Kumar on Sunday or Mason on Tuesday? No. If I had my druthers, would I have started the season and continued to start the season with Mason on the Sunday roll? Yes. Is that a condemnation of Kumar. No, it's a level of trust. I know what I'm going to get from Mason, and I feel pretty good about that. But we lived for 2 years with Walker Buehler, just crushing it on the midweek and winning important games that impact your RPI. And you know what? We've done real well on the midweek games this year. And what's the end result of that? I'm going to pull up Warren Nolan right now.
Number two in the RPI this morning.
So we were number one prior to the loss to Tennessee on Sunday, but we're number two right now. And a big part of that is not losing a midweek game, particularly at home, against the team that we should beat. And also, to be honest, we've got Louisville coming up in the midweek, so I'm okay with that. And, I think we're in a good position. I wouldn't mess with things. My only regret is, blowing that Saturday game against TAMU and not being able to get over the hump on Sunday. What a difference it would be to be going into the weekend 8-1 instead of 6-3. Or even just 7-2 instead of 6-3, because I do look at this point of the year, you're starting to look at how many games over 500 in SEC can you get in SEC play, because that's really, really important for getting that number one seed. On top of that, having the RPI to back it up as a metric, it's essential. If we want the number one seed, we've got to win the midweek games. So I'm not one to move Mason. I get that you can lose midweek games and retain your top 25 ranking, but if my priority is trying to get a national seed, I'm not willing to give up on. I like the tempering factor that Mason has brought to the midweek, giving us a solid 6 or 7 innings for each of the last 3 weeks, and allowing us to not have to go outside the circle of trust unless we're in a position where we can.
I want to get back to seeding in just a minute, but one more question from the mailbag. Nashville J says, while most of the discussion is about starting pitchers, I believe how far Vandy goes this year depends upon the relief corps. How do you think they're doing at this juncture? What do you think the relief rotation may look like by the end of the season? I know we touched on the bullpen at length earlier, but there may be some specifics in there, especially with regards to what it looks like at season's end, that you may want to touch on.
Yeah, I think we're seeing what the pitching staff is going to start looking like towards the end of the year. I think the thing we're all kind of hoping for and waiting for is for it to click into gear for Jackie Fastball, because he's such a powerful weapon out of the bullpen when he's on, and he just hasn't been right so far this year. Not an injury related situation. My understanding more of just he hasn't just clicked this year yet. That, and for Zach to get comfortable to a position where he really sort of zeroes in a little bit more and doesn't have his sometimes tendency to catch some elbows and have innings go downhill. So those are the two things that I really want to see. I also want to see Ethan be a little bit more consistent so that he can become a weapon and we're not basically a 4-arm relief corps, but instead a 7-arm relief corps, and that would make all the difference in the world. And going into the year, I think we all hoped and wanted that this would be a lot more like a 2011 pitching staff, where there were any number of arms that Corps could turn to and rely on to be able to get a key out. And that has not been the case thus far this year. We've somewhat been saved by just how good Tyler Brown has been. I mean, he's made just an outstandingly high number of appearances. I think he's up to 12 appearances already, 20 innings, and only 3 walks, no hit batsman, 29 Ks, and a 192 batting average against. If you're looking for an MVP on the team right now, I know it's easy to say JJ Bleday, but my guy so far is Tyler Brown. Really, after his first appearance in Arizona, he's been almost literally unhittable. And also at a time where you couldn't necessarily rely on anyone else out of the pen with full confidence. And the other guy who's right there with him on numbers has been Hugh Fisher, but Hugh's also been the recipient of some bad luck early in some of his appearances with inherited runners scoring. never on balls that are getting torched or anything. But so really, to me, I mean, Tyler's been outstanding. Everyone else has sort of been up and down, but you can see the potential, and you hope they really lock in.
Back to RPI and seeding and such, and I was looking up Boyd's World. They do an RPI needs thing that's great, and I know you and I both check a bunch, and that tells you basically what your record needs to be from here on to be, say, in the top 45 of the RPI, or more importantly for seeding, top 16, which is it's not an exact thing, but if you end up in the top 16 of the RPI, you're usually in pretty good shape for hosting. That's not there yet. In fact, there's a message saying that that's going to roll out today, but I guess it's going to be later on today. But here's what I'm thinking.
We are, by the way, Boyd's does have us slightly ahead of Oregon State as number 1 in the RPI as of this morning.
Okay, so we're
number 5. We're number 5 in the ISR, which is an iterative strength rating that takes into account geography. I forget exactly how, but it tends to favor the West Coast squads. So the top 4 in the ISR are all Pac-12 teams: Oregon State, Stanford, UCLA, ASU, then Vanderbilt, followed by UC Santa Barbara, Texas Tech, Texas A&M, and slowly we get to the East Coast all the way at number 9 with North Carolina State.
Well, and of course the Icers are independent of the RPI, but I do like them. But back to where I was going to go with this, I have tracked hosting and bids and stuff for years, and the thing that I'm fond of saying is that once you bank wins, those are hard to take away once you get to a certain point. That's presuming you don't do something like go 12-18 in the league, because that's when the NCAA starts at some point to say, all right, we got 8-9 teams in from the SEC. We're going to have to discriminate somewhere. I think it unfairly happened to Kentucky last year, but that's another discussion. But here's where I'm going. Let's say that they take care of business in the midweek from here on out, which they're going to be favored to do. Let's say they lose at Louisville, which won't hurt them, and so they lose one midweek game. I think at this point, they are 6-3 in the league. They can probably go 10-11 in the SEC from here on out. Or excuse me, I guess that would be... Yeah, that would be 10-11 and still host, and probably 12-9 in the league and get a national seed. And I don't know that it'll much matter where the wins come from or don't come from. They've accumulated so many. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's where I get to. This is the point of the year when I look at the plus minus, because you can pretty much bank that a +4 you're probably going to be hosting. Or at least in a hosting discussion. A +6, which is, +4 is 17-13. You'd be squarely in the hosting conversation as probably a non-national seed, but not impossible to not be a national seed in a conference as deep as the SEC. But you get to 18-12, 19-11, you're +6 or you're +8, and you're pretty strongly in the land of not only hosting, but having a strong case for a national seed. If you get to 20 wins in conference in the SEC, you can pretty much bank a national seed unless you've been a train wreck in the out of conference. So I think you're right that when you bank those wins, I think there are 2 categories you look at, which is the overall number of wins and then the plus minus in conference. I think we've seen teams with 16-14 records host in the SEC. But
Vanderbilt did. Vanderbilt's hosted with that. In fact, I remember, I think this was 2015 or 2014. I believe they did that, or 17-13. And not only did they get a host, which surprised people, but I think that year the committee said they were sort of in the discussion for national seed, which nobody expected. But again, and that's why I go back to banking wins, because they had a lot of good ones, a lot of great ones against high RPI teams.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that season, that wasn't 2015, because 2015 was a solid team. They went 20-10.
Well, I'm pretty sure it was 2014.
It was 2014. Yeah, 2014, they were 17-13 in the SEC and finished the year inclusive of the postseason number 2 in the RPI. But a nice Omaha run will do that for your RPI.
New York Dore, I know it's towards the end of your window to podcast. Any closing thoughts on the podcast today?
It's going to be a really interesting weekend in Georgia. Georgia is off to a phenomenal start, and they are leading the SEC East. If I had to guess, I would say one of Georgia and Vanderbilt will end up winning the SEC title outright, simply because we don't have to go through the gauntlet of the SEC West, which is going to pick on each other. But they've had a great start to the year. Swept Dayton, swept UMass Lowell, lost to Long Island, which is now where I live. So, kudos to Long Island. I didn't even know we played baseball other than Matt Hogan and DJ Pecoraro. Beat Kennesaw State, took 2 or 3 of Georgia Southern, Alabama State and Jacksonville State in the midweek, swept Presbo, beat Georgia State, swept South Carolina, beat Georgia State again, took 2 of 3, hosting LSU, lost to Georgia Tech midweek, took 2 of 3 at Kentucky, beat Clemson yesterday by a 5-3 score, having to face off against Kennesaw State tonight, and then hosting us this Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, Saturday at 2 p.m. Eastern, and Sunday at 1 p.m. Eastern. So it should be an interesting weekend. It is notable that they played a top 20 opponent on Tuesday and have another one to go on Wednesday. So we should be a little bit more well rested in our arms, but obviously there's enough time period between Wednesday and Friday for Georgia to come back, and they've got a deep staff. From a numerical standpoint, they've been scoring with pretty solid efficiency and have very lights out numbers on the hill. So it should be a great weekend, really interesting. And Georgia had been down for about 5-6 years, but it was always sort of an undercurrent of when will they rise again, because there's so much talent in that state. And so much of it typically goes to UGA. I mean, weirdly, Vanderbilt's had a lot of success recruiting in Georgia of late, whether it was folks like Dansby or folks like Kumar, and a bunch of people who signed with us and then went on to go pro with like Ethan Hankins, Will Banfield last year, Matt Olson, the great first baseman who has he debuted in the bigs yet, Chris?
I think he has.
Yeah, but so it's going to be an interesting weekend and a fun one to watch.
By the way, I did leave out one thing I meant to mention. One more really tough midweek game. Indiana State is 21-4 and a 31 in the RPI, and a really legitimately good team. So that's one more midweek game to watch out for. Anyway, I'm Chris Lee, the host of the Vandy Sports Podcast. He is New York Dore. Thank you for listening to our show. We'll catch you again sometime with more episodes later in the week.